Welcome to one of the most unsettling stories ever whispered through the streets of New Orleans, Louisiana. The year was 1839, when the Crescent City stood at the height of its wealth and contradictions. The riverfront teemed with ships heavy with cotton and sugar, the lifeblood of an economy built upon enslaved labor. In the French Quarter, carriages rattled over cobblestones beneath wrought iron balconies hung with ferns and jasmine. Behind those balconies, however, were lives more complex and secrets far darker than the elegance suggested. It began, as such things often do, with a small notice in the New Orleans Bee dated April 2nd, 1839. Marriage license issued to widow Eleanor Whitmore, age 42, and Samuel Carter, age 26. A brief line easily overlooked amid reports of riverboat arrivals and cotton prices. What the paper did not say, what it could not say, was that Samuel Carter had, until only months before, been listed as property on the Whitmore plantation just outside the city. Within weeks, this quiet announcement would become a scandal that consumed the city's drawing rooms, ruined reputations, and exposed a chapter of history that New Orleans would spend generations trying to forget. Eleanor Whitmore, born Eleanor Sinclair, descended from one of Louisiana's oldest and most respected Creole families. Her grandfather had arrived from France in 1763, purchasing land along the Mississippi and building his fortune on sugarcane and the trade that supported it. By the time Eleanor was born, the Sinclair name was synonymous with refinement and lineage. Parish records from St. Louis Cathedral describe her baptism as an affair attended by the city's most prominent citizens. She grew up amid chandeliers, tutors from Europe, and endless reminders that propriety was a woman's greatest virtue. At 17, Eleanor was married to Richard Whitmore, a widower 27 years her senior, who owned a vast plantation upriver in St. Charles Parish. The marriage was practical rather than passionate, a joining of fortunes and reputations. Richard's first wife had died during childbirth, leaving him a son, Thomas, then only a few years younger than his new stepmother. According to journals kept by Eleanor's cousin, Marie Leclerc, who visited the estate in 1826, the household was run with precision. Cousin Eleanor maintains perfect order, Marie wrote. She rules her servants with quiet firmness and keeps her husband's business in exact account. There is peace, but a kind of silence too, as if all breathe in measured rhythm when Mr. Whitmore is home. What few realized was how often Richard was not home. His trade connections took him to Mobile and Charleston for long stretches, leaving Eleanor to oversee the plantation. It was during these absences that another presence began to grow quietly in her life. The house servant Clara Carter and Clara's young son Samuel, purchased together from a trader in Natchez in 1823. The boy was then 9 years old. Plantation records from St. Charles Parish show that by 1835, the Whitmore estate held 48 enslaved individuals, most designated as field hands. Yet the ledgers make repeated mention of Samuel, house servant, later Samuel Carter. The addition of a surname, rare and deeply significant, appears only in Eleanor's own hand. According to Dr. Eleanor Harrington, who examined the surviving Whitmore papers in the 1960s before they mysteriously vanished from Tulane's archives, Samuel Carter was taught to read and write, with purchases recorded of books, paper, and slates marked for SC, a privilege unheard of for a man in his position. Richard Whitmore died suddenly in the yellow fever outbreak of 1836. His will, filed in Orleans Parish, left the plantation and all its holdings to Eleanor, with a separate inheritance to his son Thomas, who had by then established his own estate in Baton Rouge. Curiously, the will included one peculiar clause: "The servant Samuel Carter shall remain in the employ of my wife, and shall not be sold or transferred under any circumstances." When this clause later came to light, attorneys debated its meaning. Why would a man of Whitmore's stature protect one particular servant by name? The question lingered unanswered. Eleanor withdrew from public life for the customary year of mourning, wearing black crepe and declining social invitations. Yet her plantation, by all accounts, continued to run with seamless efficiency. Her cousin Marie noted in a letter, "It is as though Richard's death changed nothing. The fields flourish, the accounts are kept, the house remains spotless. But she herself seems altered. Quieter, yet strangely more alive. By the spring of 1838, neighbors began to notice Eleanor and Samuel together in ways that invited gossip. Margaret Duval, who lived on a nearby estate, would later testify that she had often seen them walking in the garden at dusk, like companions, not mistress and servant. A kitchen maid, Sarah Jennings, told a court clerk she had once entered the study without knocking and found the two standing close, too close. "She jumped like I'd caught her stealing breath," Jennings said in her statement. Then she sent me away, but her face was flushed red as the sun set. Rumors spread. Some whispered that Eleanor had gone mad from loneliness, others that she had fallen under some spell. Her stepson Thomas, hearing of such talk from plantation workers and merchants, grew alarmed. On December 9, 1838, he wrote to his uncle, Judge Nathaniel Whitmore of New Orleans, "I have received troubling accounts of my stepmother's conduct. For the honor of our family, I must see for myself whether these vile stories hold any truth." Judge Whitmore urged restraint, warning that the city already whispers too loudly. But he knew as well as anyone that scandal, once born, rarely dies quietly. Thomas arrived at the plantation unannounced on January 14, 1839. The rain was unrelenting, turning the sugar fields into rivers of mud. What he found, or believed he found, was never fully recorded, only hinted at in his later letter. "What I witnessed beneath that roof defied nature itself. I fled before dawn, for had I remained another hour, sin or violence would have been upon my hands." By noon the next day, Samuel Carter was in custody. The charges, vague and quickly dismissed, were enough to ignite the city's appetite for gossip. The newspapers hinted at unspeakable impropriety without naming names, and the genteel families of the quarter shut their doors. 6 weeks later, the quiet returned, until April 2nd, when that marriage notice appeared in the New Orleans Bee, widow Eleanor Whitmore and former slave Samuel Carter, united in matrimony by Reverend Silas Avery, a Methodist known for his abolitionist sympathies. The ceremony took place not in a church but within the Whitmore parlor, witnessed only by Clara Carter and a visiting lawyer from Philadelphia, Benjamin Clark. That was the moment the scandal became legend, the day New Orleans learned that one of its finest daughters had crossed the unthinkable line. The reaction was immediate and merciless. Within days, whispers turned into printed outrage. The Louisiana Courier published an unsigned editorial titled "A Moral Catastrophe in Our Midst," warning that, if such transgressions are tolerated, the foundations of civilization itself may crumble. The Whitmore name, once spoken with reverence in every drawing room from Canal Street to Baton Rouge, became a byword for disgrace. Judge Nathaniel Whitmore, horrified, recused himself from the inheritance dispute, but wrote privately to the governor that "a woman of gentle birth, deranged by grief and foreign influence, has shamed her line and our state." Meanwhile, Thomas filed a petition to have his stepmother declared mentally unfit, demanding control of her estate. For weeks, the plantation stood silent, its windows shuttered, its mistress unseen. Some said Eleanor had locked herself away in her study. Others claimed she was preparing to flee the country with her husband. None could prove either story, though the truth, it would later appear, contained a little of both. Then came the night of April 10, 1839. A letter discovered more than a century later described what happened. Written by someone identifying himself only as a witness to infamy, it was found during the renovation of a townhouse on Royal Street in 1958. 12 men rode to the Whitmore plantation that night, the letter reads. They carried torches and ropes. They called for the man Carter to come out and face justice. Instead, the widow appeared upon the gallery with a shotgun in her hands. She told them, "This is my home and my husband. You'll find no cowards here." Something in her voice turned their courage to smoke. They rode away, but not for long. When the sheriff returned 2 days later with a warrant, the house was empty. Furniture covered in sheets, hearth cold, every drawer neatly closed. A search revealed no trace of the couple, no wagon tracks leading from the property. Only one room had been cleared entirely, Eleanor's study where she had once kept her journals and account books. A servant later told investigators that the study had been where she read with Mr. Carter at night, and that before she left, she burned a stack of papers till the room filled with the smell of ink and smoke. For weeks, every road north was watched. Ports and ferries were checked. Nothing. The city murmured of witchcraft, of murder, of abduction. Some insisted Thomas had quietly disposed of them to restore the family's honor. Others claimed abolitionists had smuggled them north through secret channels. One clue surfaced in late April, when a ship's manifest recorded 2 passengers, Mrs. Ellen Clark and nephew James, sailing from New Orleans to Philadelphia aboard the St. Andrew. The manifest was signed by Benjamin Clark, the same Philadelphia lawyer who had officiated their marriage. That was the last official trace of them in Louisiana. For most of that summer, the scandal consumed the city. Newspapers printed speculative stories of the couple's fate. Preachers warned from pulpits that sin invites not only ruin, but disappearance. By autumn, the furor faded, replaced by new concerns, trade tariffs, yellow fever, and the unending talk of secession. The Whitmore plantation was placed under court management, its enslaved workers sold off gradually. Clara Carter, Samuel's mother, was not among them. Her name vanished from every ledger. 5 years later, in 1844, renovations began on the old house under new ownership. Workers prying up floorboards in the emptied study found a small leather-bound journal, wrapped carefully in oilcloth. It was turned over to Judge Nathaniel Whitmore, who, according to family letters, read it in one sitting, then locked it in his safe. 3 weeks later, the judge died suddenly of apoplexy. His widow claimed to have burned the journal, calling it a curse upon the Whitmore name, but a partial copy survived. In 1861, a young Harvard researcher named Thomas Wilbur interviewed an aging abolitionist in Boston who claimed to have seen passages from Eleanor's diary before it was destroyed. Those notes, rediscovered in Harvard's archives a century later, reveal a haunting portrait of the woman behind the scandal. The earliest entries, dated 1823, the year Clara and her son arrived, are clinical, inventory lists, household observations. The boy Samuel shows quick understanding, one reads. He learns the names of flowers and stars with one hearing. I must be cautious. Richard disapproves of indulgence. Later entries shift in tone. In 1830, I find myself watching for him in the mornings, the way he studies everything, the soil, the sky, my face. I tell myself it is only pride in his intellect, but my heart argues otherwise. In 1835, a year before Richard's death, he recited verses of Byron tonight. His voice carries the weight of a man. I dismissed him, but my hands trembled. What boundaries exist truly between master and servant when both souls are enslaved by silence? After Richard's death, the writing grows more intimate. Tonight we spoke openly. The house feels different now, as if it too breathes again. He knows my thoughts before I speak them. I have asked Reverend Avery about laws in other states. There must be a place where such love is not a crime. The final entry, dated March 31st, 1839, reads, Tomorrow we will be wed. Benjamin Clark has prepared the papers. We shall leave at first light. Clara will remain behind to protect what little remains until it is safe. I have hidden my jewels within the seams of our traveling clothes. Whatever fate awaits us, it shall be ours, freely chosen. What became of Eleanor and Samuel after that entry was long presumed unknowable. Yet in 1959, a discovery in a Quaker meeting house in Pennsylvania offered an extraordinary clue. Among papers belonging to Benjamin Clark were coded account books, later deciphered by historian Dr. Marcus Weaver, which included an entry dated June 5, 1839, special arrangement completed, TNB package delivered safely to Montreal. Funds secured for 5 years' protection. Dr. Weaver concluded that TNB stood for the new bride, a phrase used in abolitionist circles to mask escaped couples traveling north. By then, the story of the widow and her servant had passed into rumor, a fireside legend whispered on Frenchman Street or told by ghost tour guides after dark. Some said they perished at sea. Others claimed they lived quietly in Canada under assumed names. In 1963, a century later, Dr. Eleanor Harrington of Tulane University revisited the case. Her research notes, later sealed, mention a trip to Montreal and a definitive breakthrough. She vanished for 3 days. When she reappeared, she had no memory of where she'd been. On her hotel pillow lay a single pressed magnolia bloom. "The Whitmore scandal," she wrote afterward, "is not a ghost story, but a mirror, showing us not spirits, but ourselves." By the time whispers of the Whitmore scandal had faded from New Orleans society, traces of the vanished couple began to surface in the unlikeliest places. In Montreal, that distant city of snow and commerce, records from 1840 list a Mr. Samuel Bennett, importer of fine teas and spices, operating from Rue Saint-Paul, with a residence on Rue Saint-Antoine. For nearly a century, no one connected this name to the vanished widow of Louisiana. Only when researchers compared handwriting samples from Whitmore ledgers to Montreal shipping manifests did the resemblance emerge. The same looping W, the same delicate flourish beneath the signature. A local historian, Henri Desmarais, writing in 1907, described the couple as of mixed heritage, perhaps West Indian, living quietly and respectably. He noted that Madame Bennett spoke French with an American accent and was known for her kindness to apprentices and her fondness for poetry. Her husband, he wrote, was tall, educated, and bore himself like one accustomed to command. Later discoveries confirmed these impressions. In 1966, a small diary surfaced in a private family collection in Quebec, belonging to Marie Leblanc, who had worked as an assistant in the Bennett's tea shop from 1843 to 1845. Her entries provide the most intimate glimpse into their life in exile. "Madame Bennett," she wrote, "is always gracious but carries a sadness I cannot name. She keeps a locket she touches often, as if for reassurance. Monsieur Bennett is reserved, but when he smiles at her, the whole room seems warmer." Another entry reads, "A man from Boston came today and asked many questions about their origins. He spoke as though testing them. Monsieur Bennett said only, 'We prefer the climate of Canada, to breathe air free of chains.'" The man left in silence. After he was gone, Madame's hands trembled as she sorted the tea canisters. From these fragments, a picture emerges of two people living carefully, neither fully free of their past nor entirely trapped by it. They had escaped the laws of the South, but not the memories that bound them. Montreal, cosmopolitan yet distant, offered anonymity, but even there, danger lingered in the form of curious travelers and lingering eyes. Financial records from the mid-1840s show that their business prospered modestly. They expanded to larger premises, imported fine Assam and Darjeeling teas through British brokers, and contributed regularly to the Methodist congregation on Notre Dame Street, whose pastor noted their generosity to all, without regard to color or creed. And yet in 1849, their names vanished from Montreal directories. The shop was sold to a French merchant, and the residence on Saint-Antoine left empty. Scholars would later speculate that this coincided with Samuel's declining health. A death notice from 1849 records the burial of Mr. S. Bennett, age 36, pneumonia, though without further identifying details. The next trace appears 3 years later. In 1852, when a Mrs. Jane Bennett, widow, purchased a small house in Saint-Henri, then a separate municipality west of Montreal. Property deeds show the buyer signing her name in a refined, slanted script identical to that in the Whitmore journals. She lived there quietly for nearly 2 decades. Among the neighborhood's sparse church records is a confirmation entry for Grace Bennett, age 14, in 1860. Historians have debated the meaning of this name. Some suggest Grace was Samuel's mother, finally reunited with Eleanor after making her own escape north. Others believe she was their daughter, born in secrecy, named after the grandmother she might never have met. The dates align: a birth around 1846, 7 years after their flight from Louisiana. If so, Grace would represent something remarkable, a child born free from the bonds that defined her parents' lives, the living embodiment of their defiance. The last mention of Mrs. Jane Bennett appears in an obituary in the Montreal Gazette, dated February 12, 1869. Departed this life Mrs. Jane Bennett, formerly of the United States, aged 72 years, a woman of quiet grace, beloved by her neighbors, remembered for her poetry and her belief in the equality of all souls before God. The notice added that she was survived by her granddaughter, who would inherit the modest estate. The funeral took place in a small Methodist chapel. and she was laid to rest beside an unmarked grave dated 1822-1849, the lifespan of Samuel Carter, reborn as Bennett. Almost a century later, when Montreal's old Saint-Henri cemetery was relocated for urban development, many markers were lost. But according to the 1963 field notes of Dr. Eleanor Harrington, who visited the site before the transfer, one stone fragment bore the faint letters EB and the date, 1869. Beside it, she recorded finding the remains of a magnolia seed pod, native to Louisiana. Dr. Harrington's private correspondence, discovered after her death, reveals that she believed the Bennetts had descendants still living in Quebec under altered names. She wrote, "If I am correct, their bloodline continued, unremarked, undetected, through generations of ordinary families. The legacy of defiance hidden in plain sight." The possibility electrified historians. In 1969, when Tulane University posthumously unsealed her last envelope, it contained only a slip of paper bearing a Montreal address and the words, "They lived. Their descendants walk among us." The university seized the document and sealed it from public access, citing privacy concerns. Even without that address, the evidence that Eleanor and Samuel had built a life beyond Louisiana remains compelling. In 1970, construction workers demolishing an old warehouse near the original Saint-Henri site discovered a small wooden box wedged between beams. Inside were items unmistakably Southern in origin, a cameo brooch depicting a magnolia bloom, a folded page of poetry in an elegant hand, and 2 locks of hair, one pale, one dark, bound together with blue silk thread. Experts later compared the handwriting on the poem, lines from Byron's "She Walks in Beauty," to samples of Eleanor's writing preserved in the Whitmore family letters. The match was nearly perfect. The box, now held in the McGill University archives, remains one of the few tangible artifacts linking New Orleans' most infamous widow to her supposed life in Canada. And yet, as scholars debated the evidence, a quieter, more haunting question persisted. Not how they lived after they escaped, but how their bond had survived in the first place. How had a woman raised amid the rigid hierarchies of Southern society found in an enslaved boy not a servant but a mind equal to her own? What began as education became companionship, and companionship deepened into something neither law nor church could sanction. Perhaps it was the teaching itself, the forbidden act of giving knowledge, that bound them. Each lesson in reading and writing a transgression, each shared poem an act of rebellion. Somewhere in those moments, as she guided his hand over paper, the barriers between them began to dissolve. By the time they crossed into Canada, Eleanor and Samuel had already defied every rule of their world. Their love, quiet, literate, deliberate, was not the wild impulse society imagined, but something cultivated, like the camellias in her Louisiana garden. It grew in silence, hidden from view, nourished by intellect as much as desire. Their story endures not because it ended in tragedy, but because it refused to end at all. The plantation fell, the city forgot, but in another country, under another name, they continued, living proof that even in an age built on division, 2 people could choose each other against the weight of the world. The story of Eleanor Whitmore and Samuel Carter, reborn as Jane and Samuel Bennett, might have faded entirely into obscurity were it not for the obsessive curiosity of later generations. By the mid-20th century, their tale had become something between history and haunting, half archive, half whisper. A few letters in private hands, a brooch, a pressed flower, and the elusive research of Dr. Eleanor Harrington kept the scandal alive long after most of its participants had returned to dust. In 1957, nearly a century after Eleanor's death, a construction crew, renovating a row of old houses near Esplanade Avenue in New Orleans, uncovered a rusted metal box beneath the floorboards of what had once been the Whitmore study. Inside lay a cameo brooch carved in the likeness of a magnolia, a pressed camellia bloom sealed between glass plates, and a single lock of hair, 2 strands, one fair, one dark, twisted together and tied with blue thread. The discovery reached Dr. Harrington, then a young historian at Tulane University, who had already been studying court transcripts related to the Whitmore estate. Her research notes described the items with near religious awe. The cameo matches one listed in Eleanor's wedding inventory of 1814, she wrote. The pressed flower appears to be a camellia cultivar unique to Louisiana, bred on the Whitmore plantation. The lock of hair, examined under microscope, shows two distinct pigments, one of European, the other of African descent. These findings, trivial to some, reignited academic interest in the forgotten widow of New Orleans. Harrington began tracing every surviving scrap of documentation, property deeds, family correspondence, ship manifests. She even located a series of encoded ledgers belonging to Benjamin Clark, the Philadelphia lawyer who had officiated the secret wedding. His records, preserved by Quakers sympathetic to the abolitionist cause, contained entries labeled only with initials. EW and SC, safe. Funds released. Papers destroyed. In her 1963 field diary, Harrington wrote, "The pattern is clear. The Whitmore scandal was not an isolated act of passion, but part of an organized network, an underground railroad of love and defiance that carried them beyond the reach of Louisiana law." That same spring, she traveled to Montreal to follow the trail. There she visited old Methodist archives, property offices, and cemeteries. Her last recorded telegram to Tulane read simply, "Breakthrough achieved. Returning with proof that will change everything." But she never returned as the same woman. When colleagues located her 3 days later in a Montreal hospital, she was alive but disoriented, her notebooks gone. She could not recall where she had been. The only object found in her hotel room was a single pressed magnolia resting on her pillow. From that moment, the story entered the realm of the uncanny. Harrington abandoned her research and refused to speak of the Whitmores again. Those who knew her said she suffered nightmares of a woman standing at a window with a candle, whispering in French. When she died in 1968, she left behind a sealed envelope labeled, "To be opened 50 years after my death." Tulane administrators, fearing scandal, opened it prematurely in 1969. Inside was a folded sheet of paper bearing a Montreal address and the words, "They lived. Their descendants walk among us." The document was seized by University Council and placed under lock and key, where it remains sealed to this day, yet the fascination only deepened. In 1972, workmen renovating a 19th-century post office in Schenectady, New York, discovered a hidden compartment behind a brick wall. Inside was a small leather pouch containing 3 letters addressed to Mrs. Jane Bennett in Albany, dated between 1841 and 1843. The letters were signed only C. Historians soon identified the author as Clara Carter, Samuel's mother, the woman believed to have remained behind on the Whitmore plantation. The letters were heartbreakingly ordinary. Inquiries about health, mention of our mutual friend who has relocated north, and one cryptic line in the 3rd letter, "The item you left in my care remains secure where we discussed. When my time comes, I pray I will join you in the place where hearts are free." The tone suggested both secrecy and hope. It also implied that Clara had not died in 1840, as plantation records claimed, but had eventually escaped and joined her son and daughter-in-law in the north. Then, in 1959, 10 years before Harrington's death, a separate discovery confirmed her suspicions. Among the archives of a Quaker meeting house near Philadelphia, scholars found Benjamin Clark's financial account books. Decoded entries revealed payments to safe stations along established escape routes, with one line reading, "June 5, 1839, TNB package delivered to Montreal. Funds released for 5 years of security and silence. TNB, according to later historians, meant the new bride." These clues wove together an astonishing tapestry, a conspiracy of compassion that had helped one of the South's wealthiest widows and her formerly enslaved husband vanish into a new life. But with evidence came mythology. By the late 1970s, the Whitmore affair had become a fixture of New Orleans' darker folklore. Ghost tour guides pointed to a restored house on Chartres Street and whispered that on certain humid April nights, passers-by could see a woman in widow's black pacing the balcony, candle in hand. Others claimed to hear faint recitations of poetry, Byron perhaps, though none could make out the words. Local newspapers occasionally revisited the legend, dressing fact with superstition. One columnist for the Times-Picayune wrote, "If the dead carry memory, then surely the widow Whitmore haunts us not in sorrow, but in defiance." The line became a kind of epitaph for the entire story. Still, for scholars, the true haunting lay not in apparitions, but in the deliberate erasures within public record. Pages torn from parish books, missing probate files, entire years of plantation accounts vanished. As Dr. Marcus Weaver observed in his 1981 study, the mystery of Eleanor and Samuel is less about their disappearance than about the silence constructed afterward. Their defiance was so profound that history itself conspired to forget them. He argued that countless similar relationships between enslaved men and white women, between masters and the enslaved, likely existed, hidden behind euphemisms or destroyed evidence. The Whitmore case survived only because fragments were too widely scattered to be completely erased. By the close of the 20th century, the line between documentation and legend had blurred beyond repair. In archives and attics across Louisiana, researchers continued to stumble upon odd relics, a letter here, a photograph there, each suggesting that love had crossed forbidden lines more often than history cared to admit. And always, somewhere in the margins appeared the initials EW or SC, a faint echo of two people who chose each other in defiance of every law that sought to keep them apart. What remains undeniable is that, beginning in the spring of 1839, the social order of New Orleans trembled because one woman refused to obey it. Whether their spirits linger beneath magnolia shade or only in the pages of forgotten journals, Eleanor and Samuel's story endures, a reminder that beneath every polished history lies another, quieter truth, waiting to be heard. By the early 1980s, the story of Eleanor Whitmore and Samuel Carter had crossed from whispered scandal into academic debate, the line between legend and history dissolving like ink in water. Graduate students at Tulane, McGill, and Harvard traded photocopies of old letters, deciphered codes in abolitionist ledgers, and speculated endlessly about the truth of Dr. Eleanor Harrington's missing research. Yet even as scholars dissected their lives, the mystery refused to resolve itself, as though the past were determined to keep its secrets. What made the Whitmore case endure was not merely its drama, but its defiance of explanation. Historians could confirm the facts: the 1839 marriage notice, the disappearance, the Montreal records. What eluded them was motive, the inner life that had driven a woman of wealth and standing to risk everything for a man who, by the law of her world, had once belonged to her. In 1984, Professor Marcus Weaver published The Whitmore Enigma, a study that blended archival evidence with social analysis. He argued that Eleanor's act was not an impulsive transgression, but the culmination of years of education and rebellion. The act of teaching Samuel to read, he wrote, was the first fracture in the system that owned them both. Literacy became liberation, for him from bondage, for her from the suffocating confines of her own class. Weaver's book revived public fascination. Documentaries followed, along with academic conferences and heated debates on race, gender, and power in the antebellum South. Yet every rediscovery seemed to spawn new mysteries. A cache of letters surfaced in a Boston estate sale, unsigned, undated, describing our exile among kind strangers, and the eternal bloom of magnolia even in northern snow. Experts could not verify the authors, but the style, spelling, and tone were unmistakably hers. That same year, an elderly woman named Claudine Baptiste, a descendant of freed Creoles in Louisiana, claimed that her grandmother had once worked for a pale lady and her dark husband in Montreal in the 1840s. They spoke French like foreigners, she told an interviewer. She said the lady wore mourning colors always, but smiled with her eyes. They had a child, a girl named Grace, who liked to draw. The oral account, unprovable yet eerily consistent with other evidence, reignited speculation that the Bennets, as Eleanor and Samuel had become, had indeed built a family in exile. In 1995, a journalist from the Times-Picayune visited Montreal to write a feature marking the scandal's 150th anniversary. His article, titled "The Widow Who Chose Love," traced the surviving sites linked to the couple: the shop on Rue Saint-Paul, the former Methodist chapel, and a small corner of the relocated Saint-Henri Cemetery, where unmarked graves from the 1800s had been placed. "There are no names left," he wrote, only a small patch of magnolia trees that should not grow this far north. Yet each spring they bloom white against the snow, like a memory refusing to die. The imagery captured the public imagination. Soon after the article's publication, visitors began leaving flowers and folded notes among the magnolias, many inscribed simply with initials, EW and SC, or the phrase, "Love is not a crime." That same year, Tulane University quietly reopened parts of Dr. Harrington's sealed archive. Among her drafts was an incomplete manuscript titled Echoes Beneath the Moss. Its final paragraph read, "The Whitmore case unsettles not because it is unique, but because it is not. If one woman of privilege could defy her world for love, how many others did so in silence, their stories buried, their courage unrecorded? Every plantation, every parlor may have harbored its own quiet rebellion, erased before history could take notice." She had intended the book to end with that question, leaving it unanswered. As years passed, the Whitmore affair evolved from scandal to symbol, a story told on ghost tours, cited in feminist scholarship, and whispered in classrooms when students asked whether love could survive ownership. The tone of retelling changed too. What was once condemned as moral decay became seen as moral courage. Still, tangible proof remained elusive. The last great discovery came in 2004, when workers restoring a 19th century sugar mill along the Mississippi River, not far from the site of the original Whitmore plantation, uncovered a hidden chamber beneath the floor. Inside, protected from humidity by layers of lime, lay a small wooden chest. Within it, a child's primer, a slate, several stubby pencils, and a tattered volume of Byron's collected poems. Written on the inside cover, in two distinct hands, were the words, "To S, who taught me to see beyond the garden wall. To E, who taught me that words can set us free." The handwriting matched authenticated samples from both Eleanor and Samuel. The discovery offered what scholars called the first conversation between them, preserved in their own words. It also proved that their lessons, those forbidden hours spent teaching a child of bondage to read, had taken place long before Richard Whitmore's death. The secret classroom beneath the mill had been their sanctuary, hidden from the world yet alive with ideas that defied it. The chest was transferred to the Louisiana State Museum, where it remains on display beneath glass, labeled Artifacts from the Whitmore Plantation, circa 1830. Visitors rarely notice it amid grander exhibits, yet those who linger often remark on a strange quiet in that corner, as if the air still carries the whisper of pages turning. After the discovery, renewed attention returned to the possibility of descendants. Geneticists proposed DNA testing on locks of hair preserved in the McGill archives, though ethical and legal barriers halted the effort. Local families of mixed heritage claimed lineage, each story half plausible, half myth. One woman from Baton Rouge said her grandmother possessed a brooch with a magnolia and a story never told aloud. In 2015, a graduate student at McGill digitizing parish records found an 1867 property transfer listing Grace Bennett as heir to Mrs. Jane Bennett, deceased. It was the final link confirming that Eleanor's estate had indeed passed to someone carrying her husband's family name. Beyond that point, the trail vanished into ordinary history, marriage certificates, births, migrations westward, until by the 20th century, the Bennetts of Montreal had become the Bennetts of Chicago, Detroit, and beyond. No one can say for certain whether today any living person carries their blood. Yet the thought that such descendants exist, unaware that their lineage began with an act of impossible defiance, continues to haunt those who study the case. In the words of historian Patricia Lemoyne, who curated the 2019 exhibition, Love and Law, The Whitmore Affair, 39. Every generation rediscovers them, because every generation needs to be reminded that courage often begins in private, with nothing more revolutionary than kindness. Today, in the restored French Quarter, where tourists drift through candlelit courtyards and jazz spills from open windows, few notice the small plaque on Chartres Street marking the former Whitmore residence. It bears only a single line. Here once lived a woman who chose love over law. Each year, someone, no one knows who, leaves a white magnolia there at dawn on April 2nd, the anniversary of their forbidden wedding. The flower wilts by evening, but the story somehow never does. Even now, nearly 2 centuries after the events of 1839, the story of Eleanor Whitmore and Samuel Carter still drifts like mist through the streets of New Orleans. It is told differently depending on who speaks. A scandal for some, a love story for others, a parable of rebellion whispered beneath the canopy of live oaks and Spanish moss. What remains constant is its power to disturb, not through horror or violence, but through its quiet challenge to the order of its time, and perhaps to ours. When historians attempt to summarize the affair, they speak of the most forbidden marriage in antebellum Louisiana. Yet beneath the academic phrasing lies something more human and unsettling. The persistence of affection across lines that the law declared impassable. It is that defiance, the refusal of 2 people to accept the categories imposed upon them, that continues to haunt the archives. The known facts end simply enough. A widow of wealth and breeding. A man once enslaved, a wedding license, a disappearance. The rest is reconstruction. Pieces of letters, marginal notes, an unfinished journal, a pressed flower. And yet those fragments, stitched together, create something far more enduring than the scandal they once caused. In one of her final letters before her death, Dr. Eleanor Harrington wrote to a colleague in Boston, "History remembers the conquerors and the builders, but rarely the ones who simply refuse to obey. The Whitmore woman did not seek to change the world, yet by choosing whom to love, she revealed the fragility of the world that confined her." Her words capture what makes the story so deeply unsettling. Eleanor and Samuel's defiance was not public revolution but private conviction. They asked for no followers, left no manifestos, and yet, by stepping beyond the bounds of their prescribed roles, they exposed the hypocrisy of a society built on ownership, of land, of people, of hearts. In 2019, a documentary filmmaker named Renee Levine retraced their path for a PBS series on untold Southern histories. She followed parish records from St. Charles to Orleans, then the shipping manifests to Philadelphia, then to the narrow, cobbled streets of Old Montreal. The film's final scene shows her standing in the Saint-Henri district, where their home once stood, reading the inscription from the 1869 obituary aloud. Beloved by her neighbors, remembered for her belief in the equality of all souls before God. Then she adds, almost in a whisper, "They made it." That alone changes everything. The documentary revived interest once again. Genealogists, poets, and even musicians found inspiration in the story. One jazz trio recorded a piece titled "Camellia in Snow." A novelist reimagined the couple's flight as a Gothic romance. And in classrooms across the South, teachers began introducing Eleanor Whitmore not as a cautionary tale, but as a study in moral courage. Still, the mystery refuses to rest. In 2022, during digitization of the McGill archives, a previously uncatalogued notebook attributed to Thomas Wilbur, the 19th century abolitionist who had once copied passages from Eleanor's lost diary, was rediscovered. Within it, a single additional quotation appeared, one never seen before. "We did not seek to be remembered. We sought only to live unashamed. If someday our names are spoken, let them be spoken kindly, for we loved in a time when love was lawless." Whether those words were truly hers or an embellishment by Wilbur remains uncertain. Yet for many, they serve as the most fitting epitaph to their story, gentle, defiant, and impossibly human. The questions linger. Did they have descendants who walk unnoticed among us today, carrying traces of their shared courage in their blood? If so, do they know that their family's beginning was once deemed a crime? In a 1972 interview, an anonymous archivist at Tulane recalled a moment that has since become its own kind of legend. She spoke of an elderly woman who visited the university shortly after Dr. Harrington's death. The visitor, well-dressed and soft-spoken, asked to see any materials related to the Whitmore case. She spent hours poring over letters and photographs, taking quiet notes. When the archivist asked about her interest, the woman smiled faintly and said, "I'm researching my grandmother. Before leaving," she paused before the display case containing the cameo and the pressed camellia found beneath the old house. She stood there a long while, tracing the glass with her fingertips before whispering, "Some stories are better left untold, but that doesn't make them untrue." She signed no register, gave no full name, and was never seen again. Moments like that, fleeting, unverifiable, are what give the Whitmore story its peculiar endurance. It lives not in the certainty of documents, but in the tension between evidence and absence. The gaps speak as loudly as the records. Even today, when tour guides lead visitors through the French Quarter at night, they pause before a particular house on Chartres Street. They tell of a woman's silhouette sometimes glimpsed at an upstairs window, candlelight flickering around her like breath. Some say she appears every April, around the date of her marriage, and that if one listens closely, the faint echo of recited poetry. She walks in beauty, like the night. Drifts down into the street. Others dismiss it as coincidence, an illusion of light and wind. But perhaps the haunting lies elsewhere. Perhaps it lingers in the uneasy recognition that such stories, of forbidden affection, of human connection across sanctioned lines, did not end with Eleanor and Samuel. Theirs was merely the one that escaped erasure. For every journal that survived, hundreds were burned. For every whispered promise remembered, countless others were silenced by fear. The truth that unsettled New Orleans in 1839 still unsettles now. That love itself can be subversive when it refuses to obey. No ghosts are needed to make this story frightening. The terror lies in what it reveals about a society that called affection a crime and compassion a scandal. It lies in knowing how many others must have lived and died in silence. And so, as the years pass and the city changes, as the plantations crumble into fields and highways, as modern homes rise where slave quarters once stood, the echo of their defiance endures. On certain April nights, when the magnolias bloom and the air grows heavy with jasmine, it is said that one can still feel a presence in the old quarter. Not a ghost exactly, but a memory. The sense that two people once stood here and chose each other against the weight of the world. Whether that presence is real or imagined no longer matters. What matters is that the choice they made still reverberates, through history books, through the voices of those who retell it, through the quiet spaces where truth and legend intertwine. For in the end, Eleanor Whitmore and Samuel Carter did not vanish. They lived, they loved, and somewhere, their descendants, known or unknown, carry in their veins the memory of a courage that defied the law and rewrote the boundaries of the human heart. And perhaps that is why, each spring when magnolias bloom across the south and the humid air grows still, the past feels closer. The city breathes, the river murmurs, and in that brief silence between one century and the next, it is almost possible to hear a woman's voice, soft, steady and unafraid, and saying, "Love is the only freedom they could not take from us."